Hi there, my name is Vlad Razanovich. I'm the Corporate Vice President at AMD responsible for cloud sales. And it's a pleasure to join you here today at reInvent. I'm honored to be talking a little bit about the relationship with AWS as well as with AMD, and talk to you a little bit about the innovations that we're bringing to market. When I think about the year that AMD has had from a product standpoint, it's something I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about. Some information on kind of what our product portfolio looks like today, some of the latest and greatest happenings within AMD, and then I'll spend some time talking a little bit about that engagement with AWS and what we're doing with EC2 to really drive the best products and the best portfolio of instances to the market, which is utilizing AMD EPYC technology. I'll take you through that today, but first and foremost, I think I'll give a little bit of an update on what's going on at AMD. For those of you who may not know, AMD has been a market leader for about 50 years in the industry. We've delivered such innovations to the market like 64-bit technology, integrated memory controller. When I think of things like integrated PCIe Gen 4 to deliver the fastest and highest output for I/O bandwidth. And then most importantly, what we've actually just introduced, which is really the basis of our EPYC portfolio, it's our chiplet technology. And what we do is we have introduced what's called a chiplet technology, which allows you to add cores and scale the CPU to the point where you can have more cores, more I/O, more memory bandwidth than any other CPU products out there in the marketplace. And so that's something that we have delivered to the marketplace. In addition, we've pushed our leading edge industry process technology, partnering up with some of our fab partners to introduce 7nm technology before our competition. And that's both in the CPU and the GPU space. And so what has that allowed us to do? It's actually allowed us to introduce what we're in the middle of right now, which is our multi-generational roadmap, our industry-leading EPYC technology. We're on our second generation of EPYC today. And so when I think about the offerings that AWS has today, those are the offerings that AWS is using. Later this year, going into early next year, AMD is actually going to offer our third generation of AMD EPYC, codenamed Milan. And so we've publicly discussed that we're going to be launching our Milan product portfolio in the first quarter of 2021, with production starting late this year. And so we're really looking forward to engaging with AWS on those new product portfolios when they come out. I think probably the thing that you all want to hear about, though, is how hard is it to migrate to AMD-based instances? How hard is it to take something that I'm using today, whether it's on-prem or whether it's another instance type within the AWS portfolio, and bring it within AWS to start taking advantage of those AMD EPYC CPUs. And one thing I can say is that we've worked very, very closely with the AWS team on ensuring that you have this application compatibility and instance size compatibility from one generation of product to the next, or even with alternative CPU offerings that AWS carries. And so when I think about that migration, why do customers want to migrate? Well, there's a couple of easy reasons for migration. Number one, and probably first and foremost, is performance. If you can migrate from an older processor technology to a newer processor technology and get those performance gains, that's probably the most important reason you want to start looking at migrating from prior instance types to the new generations. What we are doing in our EPYC product portfolio is literally giving you double-digit performance gains from one generation to the next. And with our second generation offering within the AWS portfolio, what we see is that in many workloads, in areas like HPC, data analytics, databases, there are areas where you have double-digit performance gains from migrating from one generation to the next. So obviously getting performance is one aspect of why you would want to migrate. The second, and probably even more important aspect, is cost efficiencies. One thing that AWS has done a fantastic job of over the years is migrating customers to save money. And what we offer to AWS in the product portfolio that AWS carries within EC2, it allows customers to reduce costs. I can tell you that I talk to numerous customers out there. Being responsible for everything from a cloud perspective of AMD, I've talked to many hundreds and hundreds of customers over my career in the enterprise space, the government space, the HPC space. And one thing that has never ever wavered is customers want the most for their money. And that's been a mantra of AMD's product offerings over the years, and it's never been more true than it is today. But obviously that ease of migration is probably the most important thing. Customers, for years, especially in the on-prem business from years ago when some of the OEMs would, dominated the landscape of the server business, there was always a cost of change. And one thing that AWS does is that ease of migration reduces that cost of change. And that makes it much more palatable for customers to drive into wanting to use the newest and latest and greatest technologies that are available today in the marketplace. And so when I think about some of those portfolios that are available within AWS, what I see is that, from a offering standpoint, within the IaaS portion of the AWS portfolio, AWS has done a really nice job of putting AMD products within what's called their burstable type instance types. So that's the T3A type instance types, your memory optimized instance types, and your compute optimized instance types. And what we have seen, and this is something I actually spoke about last year at reInvent, is when you look at older generations of EC2 instances, when you start thinking about things like T2 and R4 and C4 products, that migration from those older products to new generation AMD EPYC products, that delivers a performance jump of, in some cases, 20, 30, 40, 50%. And so that's that performance jump that some customers are looking for, especially those enterprise customers that they're reluctant to change, but if you show them that type of performance migration, they're going to do it, especially when it comes to things like data analytics, high performance computing, or areas where things like real-time rendering may really matter. And I'll actually spend a little time talking about real-time rendering a little bit later in the presentation. The other thing we see is that in addition to modernization of old instances to new instances, you also have this cost optimization that happens. So one thing that AMD is very proud of is that when we engage with AWS, the mantra that AWS used was, we are going to offer AMD at least a 10% cost savings over comparable Intel-based instance types. And that's been fantastic. It really helps drive customers to want to adopt to the latest and greatest AMD technology. And in some cases, getting that extra performance, you're also going to see cost optimizations and cost benefits. And in some regions, like the Mumbai region, what AWS has done in order to really drive the market, that's an area where AWS is actually offering 45% cost savings advantage to customers in the marketplace to really start driving people to those AMD offerings. And now, so one of the things we see is that that's always good for enterprise customers, people looking for spot type pricing. But what we've also seen is that if you're using reserved instances, and this is important for a lot of the Fortune 500 corporations out there, when you're looking at long-term contracts on reserved instances, when you're up for renewal, make sure you consider the A versions of those offerings that AWS has, because that's where you can start seeing that cost savings that the AMD EPYC portfolio really brings to AWS. And so for those of you who are on long-term reserved instances, the thing that I ask is make sure you ask for those AMD offerings, because right off the bat, you will see a minimum of 10% cost savings from one generation to another, or one instance type to another. And so that's one of the big values that AMD brings to the market. More for your money. More for your money with not much of a migration cost, or no migration cost at all, but really ease of migration. And so you may ask the question of, okay, Vlad, well, where are AMD instances located? Well, I'm glad you asked. The reality is AWS has put AMD just about everywhere around the globe. When I think of the global infrastructure that AWS has, it's really this powerhouse infrastructure of, no matter what time zone you are in the world, you're going to be able to access locally instance types based off of AMD EPYC through all of the geographic zones and all of the availability zones that AWS carries. And if you happen to be in one of the few availability zones that doesn't have AMD EPYC yet, all I do is make sure you ask your AWS sales rep, make sure you ask your AWS sales management. It's really important. It's really important to make sure that AWS reacts to customer needs. And from what we've seen and from what I've seen over the last 3 years of this relationship, everywhere where I have had a customer ask about wanting AMD EPYC in the portfolio or in the region or in the availability zone, AWS has delivered. And so when we think about this cost savings of 10% all the way up to 45% in some regions like the Mumbai region, this really, there's no excuse not to look at AMD EPYC-based instances within the AWS portfolio because you're going to save money. And so if I talk a little bit more about those platforms, so I mentioned them earlier. There's compute optimized, there's general purpose, there's memory optimized. And so if we break every one of those down for a second here, the first one, and probably the one that's utilizing AMD EPYC processor technology the best, is the C5A or the C5AD instance types. And so the C5AD is the newest instance type just introduced by AWS that actually takes advantage of local NVMe disk. And so those compute optimized instance types are the ones that are really taking advantage of AMD EPYC processors capabilities. And so C5A just launched earlier this year. C5AD just was introduced recently. And these are the instance types that we see leading SaaS vendors starting to migrate to. And more importantly, HPC type customers starting to migrate to. Because if you need that extra performance, this is the products that you're going to probably look at. If we start looking kind of more at what I'll call the heart of the market, the general purpose instance types, these are going to be your M5As, your M5ADs, your T3As. I mentioned it earlier. The T3As are the burstable instances. That's what's going to get you those real small VM sizes at the most cost-effective prices out there. And then when you look at your kind of best balance of memory, I/O, network, CPU, that's going to be your M5A and your M5AD. And then on the other side, there are those customers that do look for things like memory optimized performance. And that's where the R5A and the R5AD come into play. This is when you're looking for the fastest workloads that access large amounts of data sets, especially in memory. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the areas for AMD EPYC and why we are so successful in the marketplace today is when we look at the amount of memory controllers that are coming off of a CPU. This is the one area that has really made a difference for those memory optimized applications. So that has been, in my mind, that has probably been one of the most successful areas of where we've been. And that's one of the areas where we really look at the product offering that AWS has introduced and delivering to the marketplace. So if I take a little bit of a drill down into those different offering types, I'm going to give you a snapshot of where exactly, what are some of the specifications, what are the memory sizes, the instance sizes available, and most importantly, what are the workloads that actually should be used on some of these instance types. And so the nice thing is if, and I'm actually going to start from the bottom here because the one on the bottom is the one that I think, when we think of where AMD has been successful in the market, we have dominated the high performance compute segment of the market recently. We've had major wins from the exascale organizations in the United States, things like Oak Ridge National Lab and Lawrence Livermore National Labs. They've introduced their new exascale HPC deployments, and they've all chose AMD to be based off of that next exascale of compute. And so this is an area, the HPC segment is the one area that AMD is absolutely dominating today based off of the core counts, the I/O, the memory bandwidth that we're offering to the market. And so when I look at AWS's portfolio here, this is where C5AN, Metal, and AD Metal make a difference. Obviously the N for the higher networking, and bare metal this is an area where you as a customer own the entire server. You don't just get a virtual machine or an instance type within that server. this is where you have the full capability of that entire server for your benefit. So when we think of things like finite element analytics, when we look at things like crash tests and simulation, when we look at some of the molecular biology applications for drug discovery, AMD has been made a lot of noise lately about all of the institutions using AMD technology for COVID research, and that's something we're very proud of. And so when you think of products like the C5AN metal, those are the perfect products for that research type work, that automotive crash test simulation type work. That's the type of product, and this is the offering that AWS offers with AMD. And so if I kind of take a step up from the bottom of the page there, the next instance type I mentioned, the C5A and the C5AD, these are the ones that are available. Things for applications like batch processing, video encoding, these are really starting to take advantage of that EPYC compute engine, that Zen core technology that we have brought to the marketplace. This is something that we're proud of, and when we look at the frequency, the amount of network available on the C5AD, when we look at the different sizes of VMs, all the way up to 24 XL sizes, this is an area where we think it's probably our most popular instance type to actually take advantage of those AMD EPYC CPUs. If I think of kind of that next general purpose offering, the T3A, I mentioned it earlier, it's the burstable instances. This is where you kind of have those microservices, virtual desktops, code repositories. Those are the typical workloads we see. And as you see on the screen as well, these are also the instance types that offer the smallest size, 2 vCPU instances, and up to a half a gigabyte of memory. And so these are the ones that when you're looking, if you're really, if you're a small business and you're saying, okay, how do I provide massive amounts of burstable general purpose at the most optimal cost point, the T3A is probably the most affordable product offering within the AWS portfolio. And this is the one that you should look at. Now I'll kind of step up to the top two, which are actually probably the most popular of all the offerings within EC2. When you look at things like M5A and R5A and M5AD and R5AD, remember the D is for disk. It allows for that NVMe offering within the instance type. This is where you start looking for general purpose enterprise applications. This is where you see a lot of CSPs using M5A for web servers, application servers. You see many of the travel industries using this M5A type of instance. And the other place we see where it's really predominantly used is in kind of software development. It has the right balance of memory, the right balance of CPU, the right balance of performance. And so when software developers are really developing this test and dev environment, this gives them the best flavor for what is kind of best in class performance, price performance that most enterprise customers look for. And then on the R5A and the R5AD, these are the memory optimized products that I mentioned earlier. Things like in-memory cache applications, large databases, Hadoop environments, things like SQL environments. This is the instance type that most customers look for those types of deployments. One thing I really wanted to spend a little time on today is talking about the performance of the AMD EPYC portfolio options, especially when you start thinking of really high intense applications. For instance, one is video editing and video rendering. And this is an area right now where AMD is dominating with a lot of the picture studios and those independent developers that are doing things within the market and the industry for making sure that they can take things like real-time playback and edit things as time is money. And one of the things that I'm showing right now is a demo of an AMD EPYC instance type, the C5AD, versus a comparable instance type from Intel. And one of the things you have seen is that you saw an advantage of about 10 to 12% on rendering and playback performance by taking a look at AMD EPYC offerings within the AWS portfolio. And so this is an area I can talk a lot about different benchmarks, whether it's rendering, whether it's HPC, whether it's data analytics, whether it's database. This is the one area where I really think, we have provided a really massive gain for end users. Those types of corporations that are saying, how do I get products out to market faster? How do I take advantage of taking real-time data and manipulating real-time data, whether it's financial services applications or whether it's things like video rendering that I just showed you. This is really a big difference of what the AMD EPYC powered portfolio can deliver to the marketplace. So let's talk a little bit about those customers that have actually seen an advantage by migrating over to AMD EPYC-based products within the AWS portfolio. The first one I'm going to talk about is probably a name that we all recognize, Capital One. Capital One made headlines a few years ago from migrating their entire on-prem infrastructure over to AWS. And what we've seen, even recently in the news, Capital One talked about how they've migrated all of that infrastructure and they've actually don't have any more of those on-prem data centers. And Capital One is one of those corporations that has taken a look at the portfolio of IaaS instance types that EC2 offers. And they have used us across the board. They have used AMD EPYC instances across the board. And so it's many of those things that I spoke about a few slides ago. Areas like data analytics, area like general purpose and burstable, areas like test and dev. That's an area that Capital One has migrated over to AMD, and they saw a massive cost savings to do so. A couple times at reInvents in the past, I've talked to a lot of enterprise customers. And one of the things that really holds well for enterprise customers, if even mid-sized Fortune 500 corporations, they may have spends of $1 million a month for some of their instance types. And by saving 10%, I actually had a CIO approach me once and talk a little bit about, by moving over to AMD EPYC, I actually saved about 1 month's spend within AWS, where I could actually hire more test and dev, where I could hire more people to do software. And more importantly, they actually used more instances within AWS with some of the cost savings that they had. And so when we think about corporations like Capital One who've seen that cost savings and have started that migration to utilize AMD EPYC within the AWS portfolio, that's a win-win for everybody involved. And we start looking at other major corporations like Sprinklr, probably one of the fastest growing SaaS companies out there. Sprinklr had the same type of experience by utilizing AMD EPYC. We started working with the Sprinklr team in India, and what they noticed was that for the cost savings they had for things like their test and dev environment, which for a SaaS customer or a SaaS company is very, very big, and those costs are pretty tremendous. When they saw the cost savings of using an AMD EPYC portfolio, they saw that this was an area where they can reinvest that money back into their corporation or actually start even using more AWS products within the portfolio. And so we've been happy to work with corporations like these listed here. Probably my favorite one here is actually that game company. So on the last slide where I showed you the rendering capability of the AMD EPYC CPU, this is a company that said, I'm seeing tremendous performance gains by migrating over to AMD from alternative processor choices. And so this is a corporation that said, we've seen massive gains, we've seen performance gains, we've seen rendering and editing capabilities that have decreased cycle times and made better use of some of the game developers within their corporation. This is an area where we also see AMD EPYC come out on top. And then the final corporation we have listed here, very similar to Capital One and Sprinklr on the reasons they migrated to AMD, WeGo. Now, obviously, we're all living in this day and age of COVID, and we do know things like travel budgets are down in some areas. And so it's real important for some corporations to take advantage of that cost savings without letting up or giving up any of their uptime, their service availability to their end customers. And WeGo was one of those customers that said, I see a cost savings without any performance impact here, and that's why they also transitioned to AMD EPYC-based products. So what we've seen is many, many corporations, and this is just a handful of them, that have migrated over. We know from my team's perspective, a lot of my organization talks to many of those SaaS accounts out there, many of those Fortune 500 accounts out there, and we're seeing on a daily basis more and more people migrating over to that AMD EPYC portfolio within AWS. So how can you learn more? Well, that's one of the reasons I'm doing this presentation for you guys, is to give you a little bit of an update of where does AMD EPYC instances fit and where are they good fits within your organization. There's a lot of tools available. When I think about the documentation that AMD has done from a performance standpoint, from a tech doc standpoint, from an optimization guide, these are all things that are available on AMD.com. And so I really encourage everyone to check out some of these tech docs that our team has written from both a performance standpoint, a workload optimization standpoint. You'll see things on there like Redis and SQL optimization and high performance computing optimization resources. So this is something I really encourage you to check out. We also have more case studies. You know, on the last slide, I showed you a few of those companies that have actually allowed us to use their name publicly on their use of AMD EPYC, but there's also other additional case studies like the Ample Organics case study, which actually last year at reInvent, I actually had up on stage with me to talk about how they migrated over for both a performance and a cost saving standpoint. And obviously, one of the most important things you guys need is support. You know, my team also within the AMD organization, not are we only responsible for the end customer selling touch points, but I also own all these solution architects within AMD and happy to make sure that my team is engaged on certain opportunities in conjunction with AWS sales and technical leadership as well. And so those are some of the resources and tools that we're happy to engage with as we move forward. So as a summary, when I think about, you know, I spent about 25 minutes here talking with you guys already about, you know, what is AMD and AWS doing together to really deliver cutting edge technology to the marketplace. There's a couple reasons why you would choose the AMD EPYC instances within the AWS portfolio. First and foremost, it's modernize and save. There is no more effective, performant x86 CPU on the marketplace today than the second generation AMD EPYC processor. And by modernizing your organization from older instance types or on-prem type deployments over to AWS, latest and greatest AMD offerings within the EC2 portfolio, you will modernize your infrastructure, get the most performance out of your infrastructure as possible. And you're going to save money. The other area is this migration and save. You know, I talked about it earlier, 10% cost savings all the way up to 45% cost savings. There's no better way. There's no better solution to talk about with your CFO than saying, hey, I'm going to save you money on my instance deployments within AWS. And that's really something that AMD is offering to the marketplace. And we're looking forward to engaging with AWS on future instance types to be released based off of future generations of AMD EPYC processors called our Zen 3 or our third generation EPYC portfolio. And so with that, I really want to say thank you. I want to say thank you for tuning in to hear a little bit about AMD. We've got a lot going on. I talked about the success AMD has in the marketplace. We had a great Q3. We called up our Q4 because of the server portfolio driving so much success in the marketplace. AMD is a corporation deploying things like new generation game consoles. And then one of the things you also probably heard about is our intent to purchase Xilinx, which should be completed next year as well. AMD is a company that is growing. We are staying on the forefront of technology, and we're staying on the forefront to drive new product offerings that allow AWS and EC2 to deliver the best value and the best performance for you as a customer. So I thank you for tuning in. A couple things I want to do. I want to offer to all of you to come join us in some virtual sessions. My team and myself are going to be available throughout reInvent, both in chat as well as through requested meetings. So I do request everybody go up to AWS at AMD.com to request virtual one-on-ones. And there's a kind of a cool thing here. We're actually giving away some stuff too. So there's going to be a virtual sweepstakes. I'm going to give you the first secret code here, and then you'll have to attend one of our virtual sessions to get the second code, and then it makes you eligible for some of the sweepstake offerings of the cool things that we're going to give away. And so for those of you who want to know the first secret code, is AWS C5a, the best performant compute optimized instance within AWS today. So remember that code AWS C5a, and remember to visit amd.com/reinvent for the rules, as well as making sure you sign up for another virtual one-on-one. We'll give you the other secret code that makes you eligible for the sweepstakes. So again, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time today. And if we really want to make sure that you engage with AWS, especially within the AMD EPYC portfolio of products and AMD GPU portfolio of products within the AWS portfolio. Thank you very much.